September 1894. While practically every settler in Haywood County, North Carolina, was in a mad dash to get their cabins built before winter descended, one immigrant from Pennsylvania was still toiling away, hauling fieldstone, even in late September. His neighbors openly scoffed, calling him the stone fool, and his methods a wasteful endeavor. Silas McReynolds spent 3 solid weeks constructing what appeared to be the foundation of a medieval castle, a structure 18 inches high and a full 24 inches thick, requiring a staggering 47 tons of carefully selected stone, all fitted together without a single drop of mortar. Standard practice, by contrast, took a mere 2 days max, involving little more than setting log sills atop a few flat rocks. McReynolds's painstaking method consumed 21 days of backbreaking, grueling labor. Tom Crenshaw, a local builder with 30 years of experience under his belt, flatly dismissed it. "The ground don't freeze deep down here like it does up north," he'd say. "That stone shelf is just for showing off, plain and simple." Then came the wet seasons. Cabins built directly on the ground began to suffer from dampness, floor rot, and termite infestations. The incredibly wet summer of 1896 saw a staggering 47 inches of rainfall, more than double the normal amount. Conventionally built cabins faced catastrophic moisture problems, structural damage, and serious health hazards from mold. But McReynolds's elevated cabin remained completely dry, comfortable, and, most importantly, healthy. Then winter 1897 arrived, the worst anyone in the Appalachian region could remember. Temperatures plummeted to a bone-chill. What did this Pennsylvania stone worker understand about moisture, thermal efficiency, and mountain building that generations of local wisdom had completely missed? If you appreciate stories of practical wisdom that have truly stood the test of time, be sure to subscribe. We have many more documented accounts just waiting to be shared. The September air held that first crisp promise of autumn as Silas McReynolds heaved yet another fieldstone from his wagon. This particular cornerstone, weighing a good 150 pounds, required both hands and a steady, careful grip. All around him, the sounds of urgent construction echoed through the hollow, the rhythmic thunk of axes, the scrape of draw knives, the shouted calls of men racing against the relentless clock. Every other settler in Haywood County was frantically raising walls, fully aware that mountain winters arrived without warning and showed absolutely no mercy to those who weren't prepared. McReynolds set the massive stone precisely into its position, meticulously checking its fit against the previous course, with the methodical patience of a man who had learned his trade under Heinrich's exacting standards back in Lancaster County. The German mason's voice still echoed clearly in his memory. Asterisk, done must stark sign. Asterisk, the foundation must be strong, or everything built upon it will eventually fail. Bear had taught him that proper stonework couldn't be rushed, that each stone had to find its perfect mate within the wall, and that the corners bore the weight of everything that was to come. Jake Toever paused from his own cabin raising, watching McReynolds work, shaking his head in disbelief. "Silas, you got rocks on the brain," he called out, earning a few chuckles from the other neighbors. "Man's building a fort when all he needs is a cabin. My daddy put up a house on 3 flat stones, and it stood for 30 years." Toever's own foundation consisted of just 6 limestone slabs, each roughly the size of a millstone, strategically positioned to support his sill logs a mere 18 inches off the ground. The entire foundation project had taken him and his sons exactly 2 days to complete. Tom Crenshaw, whose reputation as the finest builder in the county stretched back 3 decades, rode up on his bay mare to inspect McReynolds's progress. The Virginian surveyed the steadily rising stone wall with the critical eye of a man who had housed dozens of families in those very mountains. "Silas, I gotta ask, what are you building here? That foundation's nearly 2 feet thick, and you haven't even started on the walls yet." He gestured toward the precisely fitted stones, each one meticulously selected and shaped to interlock perfectly with its neighbors without so much as a single drop of mortar. "Ground don't freeze deep down here like it does up north. Stone shelf that big is just showing off." McReynolds straightened up, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his sleeve. At 52, his Pennsylvania Dutch frame still carried the strength of his mason's heritage, but 3 weeks of relentless stone moving had certainly tested even his considerable endurance. Ground may not freeze deep, Tom, but it sure does get wet. You've seen what moisture can do to wood when there's no proper barrier. He ran his hand along the top course of stones, where he'd carefully shaped each piece to create a continuous shelf extending a good 3 feet beyond where his cabin walls would eventually sit. This shelf's gonna shed water away from the structure, not toward it. Crenshaw dismounted and walked the perimeter of McReynolds's foundation, measuring with his practiced eye. 28 feet long, 20 feet wide, every single stone fitted with the precision of a true master craftsman. The base course stood a solid 24 inches thick, tapering slightly to 18 inches at the top, creating a substantial platform that would lift the entire cabin a good 18 inches above ground level. Through stones, long pieces spanning the full width of the wall, appeared every fourth course, binding the entire structure together with a strength that only traditional German stonework could truly achieve. 47 tons of stone, Crenshaw muttered, calculating the sheer weight represented in the emerging foundation. You could have built 3 standard foundations with a whole lot less work. He kicked at the carefully graded stone chips that filled the interior of the foundation, creating a drainage system designed to channel water away rather than allowing it to pool. What's all this for? A cabin don't need to be a castle. The mockery spread through the settlement like wildfire. McReynolds quickly became known as the Stone Fool, the Pennsylvania outsider who just didn't understand mountain ways. Settlers would ride past his building site, marveling at the elaborate foundation rising, stone by stone, while their own cabins already had walls up and roofs going on. Martha Hensley, whose husband had completed their cabin in record time using the traditional method of setting logs directly on stone piers, observed rather tartly that some folks got more time than sense. By early October, when the first frost touched the hollow, the contrast was stark and obvious. Conventional cabins stood complete and ready for winter, smoke rising merrily from their chimneys as families settled in for the cold months ahead. McReynolds, on the other hand, was just beginning to lay his first sill logs on the stone foundation that had already consumed nearly a month of his precious time. His neighbors had moved on to other essential tasks, splitting firewood, preserving meat, preparing for the isolation that winter inevitably brought. The technical differences between the two approaches were unmistakable. Standard practice called for setting hewn sill logs directly on flat stones or short piers, creating minimal elevation and maximum contact with ground moisture. The entire foundation process typically required just 2 to 3 days of work and perhaps 2 tons of stone, if that. McReynolds' approach, however, demanded the precision fitting of massive stones, careful and meticulous attention to drainage patterns, and an investment of time that seemed almost obscene by frontier standards. Yet, as October's rains began to fall, subtle but significant differences began to emerge. Conventional cabins showed the very first signs of moisture infiltration as their ground-level sills began absorbing water through capillary action. Toever noticed a growing dampness in his corner logs where they rested directly on the foundation stones. Crenshaw's cabin, built with all his vast experience and skill, began showing the telltale signs of moisture wicking up through the wood fibers of his sill plates. McReynolds' cabin floor, however, remained perfectly dry. The 18-inch elevation placed his living space well above the moisture zone, while the free air circulation beneath the raised floor created natural ventilation that effectively prevented condensation. The extended stone shelf directed rainwater away from the structure instead of allowing it to pool around the base, where it could inevitably work its way into the wood. As winter steadily approached, the Stone Fool's foundation stood ready, massive, permanent, and utterly impervious to the insidious moisture that was already beginning its slow, destructive work on his neighbors' more conventional structures. The real test still lay ahead, of course, but the foundation itself was complete, built with the unwavering patience and precision that Heinrich Behr had always demanded. The winter of 1894 arrived with Appalachia's characteristic vengeance, not the sudden, dramatic blizzards of the northern plains, but the relentless, penetrating wetness that could rot a man's bones and his cabin simultaneously. December brought the first serious test as cold rains drummed incessantly against shake roofs and turned the mountain soil into a saturated sponge that would stubbornly hold moisture until spring. The seasonal pattern was depressingly predictable: 65 inches of precipitation annually, with the 4 winter months delivering a combined 22 inches of rain, mixed with periodic snow melts that kept the ground in a constant state of saturation. Jake Tuiver first noticed the problem in mid-December when he stepped onto his cabin floor and felt a subtle give in the boards near the east wall. The sensation was barely perceptible, just a slight softness that hadn't been there when he'd carefully laid the planking back in September. He knelt and pressed his palm against the floor, feeling the wood yield slightly under the pressure. The boards themselves were sound enough, good oak that he'd seasoned properly. But something underneath was definitely changing. The root of the issue lay in physics that frontier builders rarely even considered. The sill logs, resting directly on their stone piers, were absorbing groundwater through capillary action as surely as a wick draws oil. Wood fibers, especially in the end grain where his logs met the foundation stones, acted as thousands of tiny tubes, relentlessly pulling moisture upward from the saturated soil. The process was entirely invisible, but inexorable nonetheless, and by January, the bottom logs showed the telltale darkening that always preceded structural damage. Tom Crenshaw's cabin presented an even more dramatic and disheartening case study. His 30 years of building experience had taught him to select the finest materials and employ the most refined techniques. But his foundation followed the same basic principles that had served mountain builders since the 1820s. By February, the difference lay not just in superior insulation, but in the fundamental moisture control that his raised foundation so effectively provided. Tuiver's wife, Martha, began complaining of a persistent dampness inside their cabin that seemed to penetrate absolutely everything: clothing, bedding, even the dried beans stored in supposedly sealed containers. The humidity inside ground-level cabins climbed to levels that made preservation of food extremely difficult and simple comfort nearly impossible. Condensation formed on the inside surfaces of the walls during temperature fluctuations, creating an environment where mold and mildew thrived relentlessly. The Crenshaw family faced similar challenges despite Tom's well-deserved reputation for superior craftsmanship. His cabin's interior humidity remained stubbornly high throughout the winter months, requiring constant vigilance to prevent the spoilage of their stored provisions. The moisture seemed to emerge directly from the very structure itself, as if the logs were slowly exhaling the water they had absorbed through prolonged ground contact. By March, when the seasonal thaw finally began, the cumulative damage was becoming starkly visible. Tuiver's floor had developed a noticeable sag near the foundation where moisture had softened the supporting timbers. Several of his chinking stones had worked loose as the logs shifted and settled, allowing drafts that further complicated heating efficiency. The necessary repair work would inevitably consume valuable time during the crucial spring planting season. Crenshaw's situation was even more serious. 3 of his sill logs showed advanced moisture penetration, extending a good 6 inches up from their contact points with the foundation stones. The wood had completely lost its structural integrity, developing the soft, spongy consistency that always preceded complete rot. Replacement would require jacking up the entire cabin and installing new foundation members, a major undertaking that would cost both valuable materials and even more valuable labor during the critical farming season. The economic implications were certainly stark. Tuiver calculated that his moisture-related repairs would require $47 in materials and 12 days of labor, valued at $18 based on prevailing wage rates. Crenshaw faced even steeper costs: $23 for replacement logs plus 8 full days of skilled carpentry work. McReynolds's maintenance expenses for the same period totaled exactly $0. Dr. James Caldwell, making his regular circuit through the mountain settlements, noted a clear correlation between housing conditions and respiratory ailments. Families in ground-level cabins showed consistently higher rates of persistent coughs, particularly among children and elderly residents. The damp conditions created ideal environments for respiratory irritants, while the constant struggle to maintain adequate heating inevitably led to indoor air quality problems. Yet, most neighbors remained firmly convinced that McReynolds's elaborate foundation represented unnecessary expense rather than a superior engineering solution. Tom Crenshaw, even while planning extensive repairs to his own cabin, stubbornly maintained that the Stone Fool's methods were excessive for Appalachian conditions. "One bad winter don't prove nothin'," he insisted to anyone who would listen. "That fancy stonework costs more than most folks make in a season." The stage was now set for a more decisive test, one that would definitively prove whether traditional German building wisdom or established Appalachian practices would ultimately prevail when mountain conditions turned truly severe. The summer of 1896 arrived with an ominous intensity that old-timers would remember for decades to come. June brought unprecedented rainfall, 11 full inches in a month that typically saw only 4. July delivered another 13 inches, turning mountain streams into raging torrents and saturating the clay-heavy soil until it could absorb absolutely no more water. By August, when another 12 inches fell, the very ground seemed to weep moisture, creating conditions that would test every structural decision made by the Hollow's builders. Jake Tuiver first discovered the full extent of his problem on a humid morning in late July when he stepped right through his cabin floor. The oak planking, weakened by months of relentless moisture infiltration through his ailing foundation system, gave way under his weight with a sharp crack that echoed through the one-room structure. Beneath the broken boards, he found 3 floor joists in advanced stages of decay, their structural integrity severely compromised by the constant moisture wicking up from the saturated ground through his stone piers and into the wooden framework. The physics of the failure were straightforward, but absolutely devastating. Ground-level foundations created direct pathways for moisture transfer from soil to structure. Tuiver sill logs, resting precariously on stone piers that themselves sat in increasingly waterlogged earth, had been absorbing groundwater for nearly 2 full years through capillary action. The moisture traveled steadily up through the wood fibers like water rising in a sponge, creating ideal conditions for the fungi that were slowly consuming his cabin's structural members from within. Tom Crenshaw faced even more serious damage. His hard-earned reputation as the county's finest builder made the abject failure of his own cabin a particularly bitter pill to swallow. The bottom courses of his log walls showed extensive soft rot extending a good 6 inches up from the foundation level. When he pressed his thumb into the affected wood, it yielded like cork, the once solid oak tragically transformed into something resembling wet cardboard. The structural compromise threatened the integrity of his entire wall system. The termite invasion began in earnest as soil saturation reached peak levels in August. Subterranean termites, thriving in the moisture-rich environment, discovered easy access routes from earth to wood through the ground-level foundation systems. Tuiver found the first evidence when he attempted to repair his floor damage. Extensive galleries carved through his sill plates by insects that had been feeding undisturbed for months. The termite damage revealed the fundamental vulnerability of conventional building methods. Ground-level cabins provided direct contact between soil-dwelling insects and structural wood. The stone piers that supported the sill logs created perfect bridges for termite colonies to access the wooden framework with ease. Tuiver's damage assessment revealed the grim reality that replacement of his failing foundation system would require dismantling and completely rebuilding nearly half his cabin. Meanwhile, Silas McReynolds observed the unfolding crisis from the comfortable vantage point of his perfectly dry cabin. The raised stone foundation that had earned him so much ridicule just 2 years earlier now definitively demonstrated its inherent superiority with cold, irrefutable mathematical precision. Interior humidity levels in his cabin remained at a healthy 35 to 45%, while his neighbors battled dangerous saturation levels exceeding a truly alarming 70%. The 18-inch gap between McReynolds's floor system and the ground provided complete protection from both moisture infiltration and insect damage. Termites simply couldn't bridge the airspace to reach his wooden structures. More importantly, the stone foundation created no pathways for capillary moisture transfer. Water simply could not travel from the saturated soil into his cabin's framework through the impermeable stone barrier. Temperature measurements revealed yet another critical advantage of McReynolds's ingenious method. His cabin maintained interior temperatures averaging a comfortable 68 degrees Fahrenheit during the humid summer months, while ground-level cabins registered a stifling 74 degrees. The clear difference resulted directly from his superior moisture control. Dry structures required significantly less energy to heat and cool, while damp buildings fought a constant, losing battle against the relentless thermal effects of evaporation. Dr. James Caldwell documented the alarming health implications during his summer medical circuit. Families in moisture-compromised cabins showed dramatically higher rates of respiratory ailments. The Toever children developed persistent coughs that lasted right through August and September. Mrs. Crenshaw suffered from what the doctor termed lung fever, very likely caused by prolonged exposure to mold spores thriving in the damp conditions of their severely compromised cabin. The economic devastation mounted steadily. Toever's repair costs climbed to $63 in materials alone, not even counting the considerable value of his own lost labor during the prime farming season. 3 replacement floor joists, new planking, and the necessary foundation repairs consumed precious resources that should have been invested directly in crop production. Crenshaw faced even steeper expenses, a whopping $87 for log replacement and structural reinforcement, plus the cost of the skilled labor required to jack up and rebuild significant portions of his failing foundation system. McReynolds's maintenance expenses for the same period remained, once again, at a solid zero. His cabin required absolutely no repairs, no pest control measures, and no structural reinforcements of any kind. The superior performance was certainly not accidental, but the direct result of carefully applied engineering principles that German masons had refined over centuries of building in harsh continental climates. Community attitudes finally began to shift, ever so subtly, as the undeniable extent of the damage became impossible to ignore. Neighbors who had once mocked this stone fool's elaborate foundation now found themselves facing expensive repairs, or even the prospect of complete rebuilding. "Maybe there's something to old Silas's stonework after all," admitted one settler whose own cabin showed eerily similar moisture damage. Yet, resistance to change remained stubbornly strong. Tom Crenshaw, despite facing major structural repairs himself, insisted that the extreme conditions of 1896 were simply an anomaly, an isolated event unlikely to ever repeat itself. "One wet summer don't change what's worked for 40 years in these mountains," he stubbornly maintained, even as he glumly calculated the steadily rising cost of replacing his rotted sill logs. Summer's end brought temporary relief from the relentless rainfall, but the damage was well and truly done. Conventional foundations had definitively failed catastrophically under conditions that McReynolds's raised stone platform had weathered, quite literally, without even a hint of difficulty. The stage was now undeniably set for an even more decisive test, one that would arrive with winter's inevitable fury and settle the contentious question of proper mountain construction methods once and for all. December of 1897 brought the first ominous warning that this winter would test every single structure in the hollow beyond its original design limits. The temperature plummeted to 8 degrees below zero on December 15th, colder than any recorded winter in living memory. But that was merely the ominous prelude to what mountain folk would later come to call the killing winter, a season that would tragically claim lives, destroy homes, and settle, forever and without any lingering doubt, the crucial question of proper mountain construction. January 2nd, 1898. The mercury in Tom Crenshaw's thermometer literally disappeared entirely as temperatures plunged to a shocking 23 degrees below zero, shattering the previous record of 12 below, set all the way back in 1879. Snow began falling that very same morning, not the gentle dusting typical of Appalachian winters, but heavy, wet flakes that accumulated at nearly 2 inches per hour. By evening, 18 inches blanketed the hollow, and the relentless storm showed absolutely no signs of abating. Jake Toever's cabin, already severely compromised by 2 solid years of moisture damage, faced an immediate and dire crisis. The extreme cold created thermal bridging effects that his ground-level foundation simply could not resist. Heat flowed directly from his cabin's interior, through the increasingly sodden wooden sill logs, and directly into the frozen earth below, creating a thermal drain that no amount of precious firewood could possibly overcome. His interior temperature plummeted to a frigid 38 degrees Fahrenheit despite burning 2.5 full cords of wood in January alone, enough fuel to last through most winters, under normal circumstances. The freeze-thaw cycles proved absolutely catastrophic for conventional foundations. As temperatures swung wildly from 23 below zero to brief, fleeting warming periods just above freezing, the saturated ground beneath the ground-level cabins expanded and contracted with devastating force. Ice formation within the soil created tremendous pressures that shifted foundation stones and twisted structural members far beyond their original design limits. Toever watched helplessly as large gaps opened between his logs and chinking stones, working loose from their positions, allowing bitter drafts that further complicated his already strained heating efficiency. Tom Crenshaw's cabin suffered an even more dramatic failure. The deadly combination of previous moisture damage and extreme temperature stress proved simply too much for his already compromised foundation system to withstand. On February 7th, during a particularly severe cold snap, his northeastern wall shifted visibly as frost heaving lifted and twisted his foundation stones out of place. The structural displacement was so severe that his door would no longer close properly, allowing a relentless, bitter wind to penetrate the interior. Ice dams formed ominously along the roof lines of ground-level cabins as meltwater from brief warming periods froze against the frigid walls. These dams created standing water that pooled around the foundation systems, adding yet more liquid moisture to structures already struggling valiantly with the extreme cold. The deadly combination of wet conditions and sub-freezing temperatures created ideal circumstances for structural ice formation within the wooden framework itself. The Crenshaw family finally evacuated their cabin on February 15th, when a section of the floor collapsed under the combined weight of the heavy snow load and the ongoing structural compromise resulting directly from the relentless foundation failure. 3 generations of hard-earned building wisdom, Tom's 30 years of invaluable experience, and the finest materials readily available had all proven woefully inadequate against conditions that pushed conventional methods far beyond their ultimate breaking point. The 5 desperate Crenshaws sought emergency shelter with neighbors whose own cabins teetered precariously on the very edge of habitability. Dr. James Caldwell documented the widespread health crisis during his emergency winter visits. Respiratory illnesses reached epidemic proportions in families occupying moisture-compromised cabins. The deadly combination of extreme cold, high humidity resulting from structural dampness, and dangerously poor air quality from desperate heating efforts created conditions that tragically claimed the lives of 2 elderly residents and left dozens more with persistent lung ailments that would plague them for years to come. Meanwhile, Silas McReynolds's cabin provided a stunning contrast to the widespread suffering all around him. Interior temperatures held remarkably steady between a comfortable 45 and 50 degrees Fahrenheit throughout the worst of the cold snaps, maintained with just 1 8/10 cords of firewood for the entire month of January. The raised stone foundation effectively eliminated thermal bridging by creating an insulating air gap between the heated living space and the frozen ground below. No ice dams formed anywhere on the structure because its proper drainage system prevented water accumulation around the foundation. The physics of McReynolds's superior performance were both measurable and undeniably dramatic. Conventional cabins lost heat through direct contact between their wooden sill logs and the frozen earth, a thermal bridge that efficiently conducted warmth out of the living spaces as effectively as a simple metal rod. His massive stone foundation created a significant thermal mass that moderated temperature swings, while the crucial air gap provided insulation that conventional ground-level construction could simply not achieve. Humidity control proved equally critical during those extreme conditions. McReynolds's cabin maintained. Healthy interior humidity levels were maintained between 35 and 45% in the new cabins, while traditional structures showed dangerous saturation, nearly reaching 80%. The combination of dampness in the structures and extremely cold temperatures created interior conditions that were detrimental to both human health and the integrity of the buildings. The termite damage, which had been a major issue in the ground-level cabins the previous summer, now combined with the stress of freeze-thaw cycles to cause significant structural failures. Toever discovered that insects had compromised his foundations so badly that the stones and timbers, which should have remained firmly in place, were easily displaced by frost heaving. The cumulative effect of biological and environmental damage had essentially turned his cabin's foundation into a pile of loose components held together more by force of habit than any real structural strength. The community's resistance to McReynolds's methods finally crumbled under the weight of undeniable proof. Neighbors who had previously made fun of the stone fool's elaborate foundation were now seeking his advice on emergency repairs and reconstruction plans. "That stone shelf ain't just for show," Jake Toever admitted, his teeth chattering as he assessed the damage to his own cabin. "It's saving lives." The crisis reached its peak in late February when 3 families discovered that their cabins were completely uninhabitable. Foundation failures, structural damage from ice, and interior conditions that posed a threat to human health had made conventional building methods worse than useless. They had become actively dangerous. Emergency shelter arrangements put a strain on the community's resources and goodwill while highlighting the sharp contrast between adequate preparation and genuine engineering excellence. As March approached, and the worst winter anyone in Appalachia could remember finally began to loosen its grip, the residents of the Hollow faced a difficult decision: rebuild using methods that had already proven to fail, or learn from the man whose excessive preparation had withstood every challenge the mountains could throw at them. Spring of 1898 arrived, revealing that half of the cabins in the Hollow were uninhabitable, and their owners were facing the prospect of complete reconstruction. The thaw revealed the full extent of the winter's devastation. Foundation stones were scattered by frost heaving. Sill logs were rotted beyond repair, and the structural framework was so compromised that entire buildings would need to be lifted and rebuilt from scratch. Yet, amid the widespread destruction, one cabin stood untouched, its occupant quietly offering shelter and technical guidance without a hint of self-satisfaction. Silas McReynolds opened his doors to the Crenshaw family first, providing temporary housing for 5 people whose own cabin had become a symbol of the failure of conventional wisdom. Tom Crenshaw, the man who had dismissed the stone fool's methods as unnecessary showing off, now found himself studying every detail of the raised foundation that had weathered conditions his own expertise couldn't handle. The irony wasn't lost on either man, but McReynolds offered instruction rather than lectures, demonstrating measurements and techniques with the patience of a teacher who understood that knowledge is best transferred through example, not argument. The rebuilding began in earnest as soon as the ground had thawed enough for stonework. Jake Toever's cabin needed to be completely torn down. The foundation damage was so extensive that there were no salvageable parts. But instead of rebuilding using the same methods that had failed so spectacularly, Toever approached McReynolds with a request that would have seemed unimaginable just 3 years earlier. "Teach me to build it right." The knowledge transfer happened with methodical precision. McReynolds shared the specifications that Heinrich Behr had drilled into him decades earlier in Lancaster County: 18 inches minimum elevation to prevent capillary moisture transfer, a 24-inch base with tapering to 18 inches at the top for structural stability, a 36-inch perimeter extension to properly shed water, and through stones every 4th course to bind the wall into a single, solid structure. Each measurement carried the weight of centuries of European building wisdom, adapted to the unique conditions of Appalachia. Toever proved to be an eager student, hauling stone with the desperate enthusiasm of a man who had learned the hard way the cost of inadequate preparation. His new foundation required 32 tons of carefully selected fieldstone, fitted using the dry stone techniques that McReynolds demonstrated with patient repetition. The work took 6 weeks, but Toever now understood that time invested in proper foundation work would pay off over decades of superior performance. Tom Crenshaw's reconstruction project became a community learning experience. His reputation as the county's master builder meant that his adoption of McReynolds's methods was especially significant. If Tom Crenshaw considered the raised stone foundation to be worthwhile, then conventional wisdom had officially changed. Crenshaw's new foundation included every refinement that McReynolds could teach: Precise stone selection for thermal mass, careful attention to drainage patterns, and structural integration that would resist both moisture infiltration and seismic activity. By the end of summer, 7 new cabins in the hollow featured raised stone foundations. Local quarrying operations expanded to meet the sudden demand for building stone. As word spread through family networks across western North Carolina about the Pennsylvania immigrants' superior building methods, the techniques were adopted more quickly through the informal network that connected mountain communities when people's lives depended on the performance of their homes. Effective innovations spread faster than gossip. Samuel McReynolds, Silas's oldest son, became the primary teacher and disseminator of his father's techniques. At 25, he combined his father's stonework knowledge with the social connections and business sense needed to make the methods accessible to average families. Samuel understood that superior building techniques were useless if they weren't economically feasible. So, he developed efficient workflows and training systems that made raised foundations achievable within typical mountain budgets. The documented results were crystal clear. Insurance records from the early 1900s showed that cabins built using raised stone foundations required 60 to 70% fewer major repairs than traditional ground-level structures. Dr. Sri Caldwell's health surveys showed significant reductions in respiratory illnesses in communities that had adopted the improved foundation designs. The connection between housing method and family well-being was no longer just a matter of opinion, but a documented fact. Economic analysis showed the long-term wisdom of McReynolds' approach. While raised stone foundations required a greater initial investment, typically $40 to $60 more in materials and labor, they eliminated the recurring repair costs that plagued conventional construction. Families who built using the improved methods avoided the expensive cycles of foundation repair, structural reinforcement, and emergency reconstruction that were common with ground-level cabins. The standardization of the technique happened naturally as successful builders shared specifications and refined construction methods. By 1900, the optimal dimensions had been codified through practical experience: an 18-inch minimum height for moisture protection, a 24-inch base width for structural stability, an extended stone shelf for water management, and through stone placement for long-term durability. These specifications became the unofficial building code for mountain construction throughout the region. Recognition of McReynolds' contribution didn't come in the form of formal awards, but in the quiet respect given to men whose wisdom had saved lives. Neighbors sought his advice on all construction projects, from cabins to barns to stone bridges. His reputation went from being the object of mockery to becoming a master builder. The transformation was complete when even Tom Crenshaw publicly credited him with revolutionizing mountain building practices. The legacy spread through apprentice networks as Samuel McReynolds and other trained builders carried the techniques throughout southern Appalachia. By 1920, raised stone foundations had become standard practice across the region. Their superiority was so thoroughly proven that few builders even remembered when ground-level construction had been considered acceptable. The method has survived into modern times, with contemporary mountain builders still using variations of the design that the stone fool had perfected in 1894. In 1924, as Silas McReynolds approached his 82nd birthday, his grandson recorded the old man's thoughts on the transformation he had witnessed. Wasn't about being right or proving folks wrong. Was about building something that would still be standing when the bad times came. Mountains don't care what you think is good enough. They only care what works when winter gets serious.